I can't see it coming up.
Yep, yeah, I've just hit the button.
Thank you.
There it is. We're in business. Great. Well, apologies for the technical difficulties, but welcome. This is the first Police and Crime Commissioners Accountability Meeting, or PAM. And I thought that as this meeting is being put into the public domain, I would state for the record that I've got a statutory duty under the 2011 Police Reform and Social Responsibility Act to hold the Chief Constable and through the Chief Constable the Constabulary to account for the police service provided in Norfolk. I'm going to do so certainly on this occasion against the current police and crime plan. That is the plan prepared by my predecessor, Lorne Green. I have launched a public consultation about my own plan, but this won't come into effect until the 31st of March. And I've set that date because I want to provide clarity while the new plan is being written, and also to tie that new plan to the fiscal year. So this meeting, which is conducted in the public arena, we are being recorded, and the full recording will be placed into the public domain. This meeting enables me to carry out that duty publicly so that the public can see that their interests, their concerns are being represented. I have changed the title of the meeting. It used to be called the Public Accountability Forum, or PAF, and I changed the name to PAM on my arrival, and I hope the title change is more than semantic. To my mind, the former PAF was not a public meeting in the sense that, while the public were permitted to attend, they weren't permitted to ask questions. So I wasn't sure that it was doing what it said on the tin. The public were able to witness the PCC holding the Chief Constable to account, but they had no voice in that forum. My view is that the PCC holds the Chief Constable to account on behalf of the public of Norfolk. So while on the face of it, I'll be running this meeting in almost the same manner as before, I have invited the public to submit questions, which I'll include with my own questions. I was really pleased by the public's response. 34 questions were submitted. Of these, some were about matters that are not directly relevant to the police. For example, a question about litter in the doorways of the former Debenhams building in Norwich, which I'll pass on to Norwich City Council. There was some about parking and problems with that, which I'll pass on to Norfolk County Council, who are responsible for parking. There were then some that were not appropriate, I felt, to put to the Chief Constable at this stage. For example, there was a question, very good question, about how the police would apply the provisions about protests in the forthcoming Police Crimes Courts and Sentencing Bill. This meeting holds the Chief Constable to account about the police service being delivered. Present tense is deliberate there. So I felt it was not right to ask the Chief Constable to speculate about how he might implement legislation that is still being prepared by Parliament. So that's why I haven't brought that one forward. There was another question that concerned a burglar in Hunstanton that I didn't feel was appropriate for this meeting, as it expressed unhappiness about a specific issue. So what I've done with that one is passed it to the constabulary to be addressed as a complaint. So in all, of the 34 questions, 13 will be addressed outside this meeting. I've got the remaining 21 questions with me, and I'll endeavour to ask as many as I can during the course of the meeting, but I don't promise to get to all of them. But if I don't get to any, answers for those will be published online after the meeting. What I have found interesting is the range of topics covered by the questions submitted. Visible policing, speeding motorists and antisocial behaviour top the list in number. Meanwhile, there was nothing, certainly on this occasion, about high harm issues such as domestic abuse, county lines drugs, and so on. The list of questions is a useful barometer check of what is worrying the public, but it does reflect my concern about what I've described as the expectation gap between the public's expectation of visible policing and the constabulary's obligation to deal with crime, much of which is high harm, and a lot of it happens outside the public view. a sense probably the best way in the long term of dealing with this, of bridging that expectation gap, is for the Chief Constable and I to meet the public virtually or in reality, and to hold Q&A sessions where we can both address the concerns raised and also explain how this expectation gap is being bridged. And I think that's a plan we'll develop for the autumn and new year. I think it's also worth mentioning, again, for the public's interest, that this meeting is not the only means I have to hold the Chief Constable to account. I get a mailbag, I pick up points from the public when I'm out on the ground, I pick up points from the media. Most of these I feed into the constabulary via the police liaison officer who is on my staff, and that enables me to get answers and to respond to these individual points, some of which, of course, are in effect issues of accountability. And of course, if there are points of particular concern or particular urgency, I have obviously got the ability to raise those directly with the Chief Constable as part of routine business if I need to do so. However, all of that goes on behind the scenes rather than in public. And so it's important that this meeting is held in public, and a number of the strands that have been asked behind the scenes have actually come up in the questions that the public has put forward for this forum. So that is quite tidy. Right, let's now move on to the agenda. And I think we begin with apologies. What apologies do we have?
One from our side, Commissioner, which is Simon Medjicks, who's on leave this week.
Grant, none from our side, I don't think. Oh, yes, it was Gavin Thompson, who's got a meeting to do with victims, which I felt was more important as the voice of the victims. Okay, item 2 then, declarations of personal and or prejudicial interests. Any cries from the floor? I'm operating off one screen, so forgive me if I'm slow picking people up, and please don't be shy about jumping in. Again, part of the technological issues I'm having this morning. Okay, so no conflict of interest or anything of that ilk. Item 3 then, to confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 9th of March. 2 parts really. First, that they're a true and accurate record of the meeting, which I didn't attend. That was obviously in my predecessor's time, and indeed, Paul, your predecessor's time. And secondly, to pick up any actions arising. And I'm not aware that there are any actions that we need to carry forward to this meeting. Any thoughts from the floor?
No, from our perspective, the action, sorry, the minutes accurate, and yeah, no actions, I believe.
Fantastic. Okay, item 4, an update from the Constabulary about COVID-19.
Thank you, Commissioner. Just some highlights really from us on this. Across the county, as of yesterday, the average number of daily cases in the last 7 days was 365.3 per 100,000. That's a slight decrease from the week before, but everyone on the call will be aware of the national trend. Norfolk is broadly following that. I believe in the county in the last 7 days we've had 36,000 circa positive tests. Sorry, persons tested in the previous 7 days. So certainly COVID still meaning a lot for the residents of Norfolk. I think on the 25th we had some 44 people in hospital across the county. So that's from a Norfolk perspective, that's where we are. In terms of the impact upon the constabulary, you'll be aware that a couple of weeks ago we had a particular problem with the number of activations from the Test and Trace app in our control room. I'm pleased to say that contingency planning operated very well there. We managed to ride that storm by deploying police officers into the control room to backfill behind our call takers who were self-isolating. Of course, that did have an impact on visibility. Those police officers did come from other roles, but we were able to maintain service on 101 and 999. As of yesterday, we had 36 police officers who are classed as active COVID cases and 28 staff. And within that definition includes those who are self-isolating and those who've had confirmed positives. Obviously, as we go into our busiest time of the year, that's a number of staff off the front line and out of our key departments that we would like to have alongside us. But again, it's a reduction from where we were a couple of weeks ago. We are at battle stations really when it comes to COVID precautions within the constabulary. We haven't softened our posture at all since the most recent changes in restrictions, and we continue to be very alive to the threat. Because whilst that link between infection and hospitalisation has faded, the impact on us in these busy months of not having staff at work is considerable, hence high levels of infection control. I'm more than happy to take questions, but I think they're really the main headlines that I wanted to share this morning.
Thank you. I'm just trying to think if I have any questions. I mean, from my perspective, the important thing is that we weathered the particular storm that the pingdemic produced, and given that you had properly prepared plans, that that's encouraging. Hopefully, as COVID recedes into the rearview mirror, we won't be tested as seriously again. But it is extremely reassuring that when we were tested, it worked as well as it did. So, congratulations on that. That was good news. No, thank you. We do. There are certain critical areas in the constabulary where the impact of the pings will be more significant when it occurs, and the control room was one of them. We do now have a bit more wriggle room by virtue of some new public health guidance to enable us to do more testing in the workplace in that eventuality. So that gives me some peace of mind. I'm also reassured by the number of employees, both officer and staff across the constabulary, who are now double vaccinated. We have some good data on that, and we have strong levels of protection in that regard. So the key period is between now and the 16th of August, when there's another change in posture, but touching wood, so far so good. Grant, thank you. If there's nothing further on that item, let's go on to the next item, which are the public's questions for the forum. We've set aside about half an hour to deal with these. There are quite a lot, and I've grouped some of them into sort of thematic groups, but I'll just sort of go through them as I've got them on my scratch pad. So forgive me if I jump around in contrast to any sort of orders of batting that people may have. The first one I've got arises from correspondence that came into my office and was then followed up by a question, and it was related to the ability to contact local officers directly, and it refers particularly that this relates to one incident, but I've had two other instances where people have said they wanted to go to hand stuff into a police station, and although the police station was billed as being open, they couldn't get anyone to answer the door. And of course, the yellow phone on the door puts them through to Wyndham and the ops room there. So the question was, why is it not possible to contact local officers directly? And it's obviously a point of concern for the public. So I wonder if you could address that in the round rather than the specifics of the case I mentioned. So, Commissioner, what I'll probably do with all of the questions is, if they come into me, then I'll allocate them out to the relevant chief officer. Delighted. Yeah, makes absolute sense. So if that works, I will hand this one to Nick Davison. What I would just say is, just reflecting back on the COVID response update from a moment ago, we are, for good infection control reasons, still trying to limit the number of persons from outside who come into our police stations. But more specific to 101, I will now pass on to Nick. Nick.
Thank you. So, Commissioner, specifically, I think obviously this was Genesis was around about trying to hand stuff in, I think, to local police stations and not being able to get an answer. So
It was.
across on that particular point, across Norfolk, we've got 3 sites that are permanently staffed in terms of our public inquiry staff members: Great Yarmouth, Norwich and Kings Lynn, where we will always have, during the opening hours, members of police staff in that public inquiry officer function where material can be handed in. So I think that's the first thing I'd like to say about that. Now, of course, you know, if you're 10, 15, 20, 30 miles away from those communities, then of course that's not something that you necessarily want to do yourself, and I accept and understand that. At some of the other police stations that we have, we do have volunteers that enable the police station to have some hours of opening, and they should be published on the website. But of course, the impact of COVID there with volunteers who are typically members of the public from older generations is that has been severely challenged over the last 15 months because of COVID, for understandable kind of safety reasons. So in normal times, there is a greater capacity to be able to hand stuff in at police stations that are local to individuals. But for COVID, we will obviously see what coming out of COVID means in terms of our ability to step back into that space. To the wider point about contacting local officers directly. So local officers can be contacted directly. Each of them has a local personal email address. So, for example, if an officer is handed out to a member of the public that they're dealing with over a previous matter, their email address, then, you know, there is obviously potential for that member of the public to do just that. Equally, many of them have personal issue work mobile phones, and again, they can hand out a personal mobile phone number on an existing matter. So there's those 2 methodologies. There is another methodology that if you did dial 101 switchboard, that was picked up by the switchboard operator, said, I need to speak with the officer at Sprowston Police Station. Then what they will probably typically do is, if they can't get through and put you through there and then, is that they'll take your details and email the officer for when they're next on duty and ask that officer to contact you then. So that's another way that you can get in contact with a local designated specific officer that perhaps you've got an ongoing kind of work-related relationship with. And then finally, on our Norfolk Constabulary website, on the very, very front page, as soon as you open that up, you put your postcode in, it'll bring you to the right neighbourhood policing team for your community. There is a neighbourhood policing team generic email address, which again is monitored, and you can email there and say, I'd like the local beat officer to contact me back, provide your details. That's a monitored email account, and then within the next few days, subject to the officer's availability in terms of rest day working and shift patterns, then they can contact you that way. Now, there is a problem, of course, with this, is that the organisation manages hundreds of thousands of contacts from the public in terms of providing a policing service every year. And we've got to ensure that we provide a professional response to each and every one of those and keep track of those ones, particularly when it relates to crimes, to vulnerability, to matters of considerable substance. So that's why we've always got, and have always had as a police service in the UK, that accepted, understood route through 999 calls if it's an emergency. And also the routine 101 calls for non-emergency calls. And most of our contact is channeled through those routes, because they go into one central point in the control room where we've got staff that are trained to be able to assess and judge and understand the threat, risk and harm and evaluate what that is, be able to record it on our computer-aided dispatch system, which we call Storm, or onto our crime recording and intelligence system called Athena. And then once that's logged, of course, we can then track the progress of that call to service from the member of the public to wherever it needs to get to in the organisation. And if we didn't do that, then we couldn't keep track of all of these hundreds of thousands of contacts from the members of the public, whether it's 101, 999 or into the email into the control room. So there's this balance to be had, I think, is what I'm saying, Commissioner. So the caller, the questioner, was saying, why can't I contact local officers directly? Well, you can, and I think I've laid that out, but I've also, I think I've articulated why there's a balance to be had here, and why actually our main routes of contact are through the control room for all the reasons that I've just described.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it would be logical to follow on with the two other questions we've got on the 101 calls system, just to make sure we've taken them. One was actually raised in July 2018 at accountability meeting, and it was they undertook to assess the average wait time to be answered, the maximum time, the proportion of callers who hung up not being prepared to wait for an answer. Could you publish their assessment and whether there's a significant improvement in service? And the second one, who happened to be a councillor, I'm not sure if he was a county councillor or parish councillor, who expressed concern as to how long 101 calls are taking to be answered by the control team. You've touched on some of the background to those. Do you have any greater detail of where we're at with particularly answering 101 calls? And I'm particularly mindful that this was reflected in the precept consultation back in the new year. So I wondered if you could give us a readout on progress as a result of that measure.
So, Commissioner, if I just come in at the outset and then again I will pass to Nick. That question starts by, as you say, referencing back to July 2018, and since that period there's been a complete change in how we operate within our control room, with in part through that precept investment that you reference, with enhancement around our switchboard facility, and also the purchase and implementation of a new system to manage 101 calls. So I'll ask Nick to focus very much on the how we're doing now, because I would imagine that that's probably the most relevant point. And Nick, if you could just provide some stats as to what the last couple of months have looked like, if possible, that would be useful.
Okay, thank you. So, Commissioner, we have completely restructured the control room, and we've made significant investments, which are in part halfway through. So we've had new members of staff going to our switchboard function, and that is now up to a significantly increased establishment number. I think that's moved from something like 12 operators up to 27 operators, and the last batch of trained people are just having their final mentoring. So that's really provided significant support around the switchboard function. We've also had an uplift in terms of the number of communications officers that then deal with the actual call, whether it's 909 or 101, if it needs to come to them because switchboard can't deal with it. And again, last Friday, I kind of closed the course for those individuals, and they're now mentoring in the room. And again, they will be kind of independent in a week's time. So again, that's good news in terms of our capacity in and around that. What I would say contextually is we're now taking on average double the amount of calls for service than we were 5 years ago, in terms of the actual call demand that goes into the constabulary through the control room, whether it's 999 or 101. So double to what it was 5 years ago. But even despite the inputs in terms of the extra staff that we've gone in there, you know, we haven't had a doubling of increase in the FTE. So actually, in terms of being efficient and effective and trying to manage that significant increase in calls for service, the control room typically does very well and runs red hot. So some more recent kind of call times is, so for the month of June, 90% of all calls that were going into the switchboard and answered by switchboard were answered within 2 minutes and 6 seconds, which I think by any call centre standards is pretty strong. The current position for the month of July, up until the latest data set that I've got available for the first 18 days of July, actually show that as an average of about 45 seconds. So again, those new staff in the switchboard coming online, starting to already have some positive impacts there. So then the calls that go beyond switchboard, that then be dealt with on the 101 system by the comms officer. The average for June there was 4 minutes and 34 seconds. And if we were to take a snapshot of pre-COVID performance, again, the average there was just slightly less than that, probably about 10 seconds less than that, but you know, certainly within the 4 minutes, 10-20 seconds. So actually we're doing really well in comparison to the stress and the strain that switchboard is the control room is under because of COVID and all the things that we've heard to date in this meeting, and comparing and contrasting. Now there will always be, I'm afraid, people that call 101 that will experience a longer than satisfactory delay, both in terms of what we want to deliver in terms of a service to them, but also in terms of what they expect. And the reason why we've got that is that there is never enough resource to meet the demand, and demand obviously fluctuates throughout the day. So if a member of the public is going to call us between 4 o'clock in the afternoon and 6 o'clock in the evening on a Monday through to Friday, and when they get to the 101 triage system that we've got, which is an automated system, and perhaps they want to speak to us about something which is, you know, less than urgent, is maybe an administrative matter rather than a priority that we might have on 101, which would be for hate crime or domestic abuse or some other kind of threat-based issue, which is not a 999 system, then the system will triage them down in terms of prioritization, because, you know, they've self-selected that this is just about administration, whereas somebody else may have self-selected to say, I need to report you that I'm subject to domestic abuse, and whilst it's not 999 now happening to me, I definitely need to speak to you urgently, and the system will self-select them as a greater urgency than the person that's just self-selected as an administration. But what we do on the system is the switchboard will come into that administrative call and say, look, you are going to be waiting for an extended period of time. Can I just check to make sure it is just basic administration, and reprioritize them if actually they've done that wrong and it's actually more urgent? Or they will suggest to them there are other ways of being able to contact the constabulary to get the answer that they need, either by email or by calling at a time of the day when it's going to be less likely that they'll have a long queue. But we see on many occasions the individuals saying, no, I understand that, and I am prepared to wait, despite the fact that they've been told the waiting time. So that's not helpful, of course. It's not the service we want to give, but it's not the service that people would want to receive. But there will be circumstances when that does happen. We've got triage in place, as I've just described, which hopefully helps the member of the public understand, and the resources that are coming online. It is our belief that come September, when it's all embedded down, we will see less and less of that and much more improved performance time, which of course we'll share with you in future meetings.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I think you've actually addressed the suggestion that was made by one of the questioners about a callback feature, because effectively the triage system is that callback feature, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, grand. Thank you. I said I'd jump around, and I'm afraid I'm going to. I'm jumping from 101 to dogs. The question asks, I'd like to ask what is being done to make dog owners feel safe from dog thieves. And I think the nub of the question is, how seriously is the issue really being taken? I'm aware from while I was campaigning for this job that it is a growing issue out on the street, and a greater concern amongst the public. I think the fear of dog theft is even greater than the actual dog theft, but I wonder if you could take that one, please.
So, Commissioner, I think your last point into that question is the pertinent one here. Over the past year, and particularly during lockdown, there has been growing public concern about the level of dog theft, and numerous accounts circulating on social media about instances where puppies have been stolen. When we've actually looked at prevalence in the county, the prevalence is far lower than is being suggested within those social media discussions. We know that other parts of the country have been particularly affected by dog theft. In Norfolk, we have seen, I think it's 16 offences in the past year, and that is a stable level. Now, obviously, that's 16 offences too much, but perhaps not at the level that is causing the anxiety and concern amongst our communities. All of that being said, we do take it seriously. There's a lead officer appointed in the force to deal with dog theft, and we continue to work closely with Trading Standards, RSPCA, and other partners to try and prevent it.
Graham, thank you. The next one is the question about concern about national and local level of fraud and financial crime, and the suggestion of a lack of police response. Given the endemic nature of financial fraud, cybercrime and scams, which have touched so many people and cost millions in losses to innocent victims, one has to ask, what is the police in Norfolk and nationally doing to tackle this? Perhaps you could have a look at that.
I happily. And Nick, do you want to come in on that one?
So, Commissioner, HMIC, Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, reported on this back in 2018, and since that time, the head of our crime, Detective Chief Superintendent Chris Barmer, has been chairing a fraud delivery group to ensure that the constabulary's response to fraud is coherent, structured, coordinated, and we can take that forward in terms of supporting members of the public who are experiencing that crime. I think one of the perhaps examples that I'd like to talk about here is what we call operadium. This is currently a courier fraud that sadly residents in Norfolk communities are experiencing. In short, the criminals are pretending to be police officers or members of tax and revenue, and trying to elicit support of the victim by saying, we need you to help us with a police operation because your local bank is using counterfeit currency and money, and we need to get access to what's held in their bank. Can you please go and withdraw £6,000, £7,000, £10,000 worth of your money and hand it to us so we can check to see if it is in fact fraudulent? Yeah. And sadly, that's ongoing and has been for some time now. And unfortunately, because people in our communities trust the police, they are complying and handing over that amount of money at their doorstep when a courier attends to actually recover that funds from them. So we've had a massive operation, which we've called Operadium, that has sought to deal with that in terms of, taking the fight back to the perpetrators of such fraud, whether it's online or courier fraud, as I've just kind of focused in on, and a real plan around trying to investigate, catch the perpetrators, put pressure on the perpetrators, and we've had some good success around that. We're finding they're typically based in London, and then sending couriers up to Norfolk, but all other parts of the UK as well. But we've had a number of arrests in respect to that, and actually we're expecting some sentencing tomorrow, with substantial sentences from 3 individuals that were collectively between them had stolen something like £600,000 worth of people's money in terms of that. So taking the fight back to the fraudsters, but also educating the public through communication, scam busters, in work with partnerships such as Trading Standards and Norfolk County Council, to get a real kind of sense of raising awareness about the impact of fraud on people so they don't become victims to it themselves, but also the investigation of the actual crime itself and bringing those perpetrators to justice, as evidenced by that Operadium example. So it's taken seriously. There is, of course, the National Action Fraud link in as well, which is deals with. We do get stuff that is sent back to Norfolk from Action Fraud, which we then will investigate locally, and we will contact each of those victims of fraud to make sure that we have a good understanding about what their experiences were, so we can learn about the MO of the offender, but also give them some crime prevention advice as well to keep themselves safe. So it is a really intrusive crime. We're on it. We've got a plan. We tackle the offender, but we also support the victims by raising awareness and helping them to protect themselves. And we do that in partnership through Scam Busters right across the county.
And can you say a little bit more on the cyber side of the business?
So we have a dedicated cyber team within the joint space with Suffolk, who can go out and provide advice and support to both residents and also to business communities in terms of keeping themselves safe around cyber fraud, whether it's cyber-enabled types of fraud activity, the emails that you get, which you click on the link and then it inserts malware into your own personal home computer, and then starts to download over your personal sensitive information. So we can go out and provide that service to people. Again, linked into the Scam Busters campaign with partnerships. There's lots of support that we put out there through communication, raising the issue with members of the public, trying to give them some ideas about how they can keep themselves safe, along with actually a lot of industry, because I think we all recognise, don't we, we're now getting correspondence and emails from our banking partners that we partner with, and they're telling us to kind of keep ourselves safe too, and we're obviously doing that alongside industry as they come to deal with the whole issue about cyber fraud, which is ever present these days. The best way to deal with cyber fraud, I'm afraid, is for us to all individually think about what we can do personally to protect ourselves, how we go about our business, making sure that our passwords are actually passphrases and complicated and not easy, not like, your surname 123, which, criminals will just be able to actually deal with easily, that you don't open emails that you don't understand or recognize where they've come from, that if you have any suspicion about them, you just don't touch any of the links within them. But what you do is you close down your email web page, you open it up again, maybe even switch your computer off, reboot it, open it up again, and then contact your bank, but not through the original web page that you went to, and ask them if this is the case or not. So there's lots of things we can all do to protect ourselves, and the best way to actually counter cyber fraud is to do just that, because typically many of the individuals perpetrating it are overseas in other countries where actually it's very difficult to be able to pursue them in terms of criminal convictions and bringing them to justice.
Graham, thank you. Continuing the theme of jumping around, 2 questions raised the issue of e-scooters, and one was a disabled person who was concerned about being knocked down on a pavement, and another again was on the pavement again. What are we doing about e-scooters? What's the state of play on these?
Commissioner, we are regularly finding that our officers are stopping e-scooters now. They're a new trend, another new demand for us to deal with. To be clear, it is illegal to ride one on a pavement, and if they're being used on the road, the rules of the road apply. The same rules as that would be applicable to motor vehicles. The Constabulary has confiscated numerous e-scooters over recent months, work that's being done both locally through neighbourhood policing teams, but also through our road policing team. And we have put out a considerable amount of social media guidance on e-scooters, along with district council, so that we are clear to owners as to what their responsibilities are. With some of the shops that sell e-scooters, we have encouraged them to provide leaflets to those who purchase the scooters, so they know exactly what can and cannot be done with them. I recognise that these vehicles, when driven in the wrong way, in the wrong places, can cause considerable danger to other road users, and particularly members of the disabled community. So it is something that we will respond to. Worth noting, there is a pilot scheme in Norwich at the moment with regards to scooters, where some exemptions apply. But in short, it is a new threat, but one that we are responding to.
Grant, thank you. Mindful of time, so I'll move swiftly on. I'm looking now at the questions I've grouped together. I think we've got 4 questions on visible policing. More constables on the beat around Swaffham. Another one saying, could we have more police on the beat walking neighbourhoods, please? Can community policing be further developed? Reference to your park, walk and talk with an adjunct on PCSOs. I wonder if you could take that group and comment on what you're doing to drive forward visible policing.
Yes, happy to. there was a question. I'll just deal with the PCSO bit first, if I may, Commissioner. You'll be aware that Norfolk is the only constabulary not to have PCSOs. That followed a local policing review a couple of years ago. At the heart of that business case was the reality that it costs us more to employ a PCSO than it does a police officer. And that pay difference remains as of today. Yet police officers have greater powers and greater flexibility in terms of their deployment. So there is sound business sense in the recruitment of police officers for those reasons. Moving on to visibility, the deployment of the police officers we have is in large part determined by the nature and volume of calls that we have and the threats and risks that we deal with. And earlier on in the meeting today, you made reference to the gap between expectation and the demands that we receive, and that's a real challenge for us. I have been very clear in my early days in this role that I want to do my best to increase visibility. We have started some local initiatives. One of the questions that you mentioned referred to Park Walk and Talk. That is encouraging our officers to get out of their cars and spend some time in their communities at times of peak footfall so that we can increase visibility. I think visibility is also about improving our communication so that people know where we've been and know where we will be as well, so that it maximises the chances that they have that feeling of security because we are out on their streets. I was presented with some data relevant. It was to just South Norfolk and Broadland a couple of days ago, but it's as applicable anywhere. And the number of high visibility engagements that we've had in those two districts in recent months was in the 800s. So we're often doing more than I think that we sell to the public. So we are looking at how we can improve the communication as to what we do. So in short, I recognise that there's a strong desire for the public to see more of us. Through equipping officers with better technology so they can be out of police stations, through improving our fleet so that we have a highly visible fleet, and through encouraging my officers to get out of their cars when demand allows, I think that we can achieve that. Of course, I do need to be realistic though. In the earlier answer, Nick referenced the volumes of calls that we're receiving. We had 2 days this month that were equivalent of New Year's Eve demand, and those are jobs that we do need to send officers to because lives are at risk and safety is in play. And inevitably, visibility often has to fall second to those demands. But I recognise that it's what the public wants, and I do recognise that it has a crime deterrence effect. So as far as possible, we will be promoting visibility where we can across the county.
Thank you. One supplementary, if I may, going back to PCSOs. The business case makes absolute sense for and your explanation of why we got rid of PCSOs. But I think where the public feel the loss of PCSOs is through abstraction of the community police officers. And you alluded at the end of the answer there to the pressures you're under. Is there anything more we can do to minimise abstraction of officers from community roles, or is it really a simple matter of prioritisation and needs must, and therefore we've got to bear pain somewhere?
So abstraction has been a challenge in the last couple of months in particular. Earlier on, I made reference to the challenges of the test and trace app and the number of pings that we had. That required us to put officers into the control room just so we could ensure we answered the calls, and that that is real protection of life stuff that we just have to do. On top of that, we've had European football championships. We've sent officers down to Cornwall for summits. And again, that all drains from that visibility capability that I do have. And it's inevitable that visibility ebbs and flows, particularly as you go through your busiest months, and we're in the heart of our busiest periods at the moment. However, Nick Davison and I have been talking about what we can do to ensure that those abstractions are minimised as far as possible. Part of that is ensuring that the abstraction pane is shared across functions within the force. Sometimes, Commissioner, it might be about the smart use.
Constabulary's efforts to address the whole thorny question of speeding.
Yeah, they're questions which show the challenges of policing, actually, Commissioner, because the unmarked traffic patrol doesn't achieve the visibility aim from the previous questions, and they're the challenges we have. But I'll ask Eamon Bridger to just summarise our activity on all things policing of roads. Eamon.
Morning, everybody. It's nice to give Nick a bit of a break. So pleased to be able to contribute to one of the questions here. So we absolutely recognise how the importance of roads policing enforcement, both from the community perspective of what our public are telling us they want, but also clearly from the safety element, because this is ultimately about keeping road users as safe as we can possibly make them. As with all things, there are finite resources, and the Chief has just mentioned there, we do have the capability to deploy covertly, not fully covertly, sorry, unmarked vehicles, and also with a visible presence. Those finite resources are targeted towards what we would class as the fatal four. We know the factors that contribute to the road collisions that have the greatest harm. Those being the lack of wearing of seat belts, the use of mobile phones, impairment through drink and drugs, or indeed speeding. So we know that they are the areas that can have the greatest impact if we concentrate our enforcement activities against those public activities. We also concentrate based on what data tells us, so the hotspot areas where accidents happen the most, and the times indeed that they happen the most. So we try to use a smart approach to our deployment of our roads policing assets. Clearly we can't be everywhere at all times, but we do have good levels of success and really strong returns around enforcement where those elements are concerned. We have some specific initiatives. So we recently run an initiative against heavy goods vehicles, concentrated on offending caused by those vehicles on the strategic road network, because again, that can have a huge impact around public safety. We do encourage the public under Operation Snap to provide us their dashcam footage that we can then exploit and look to use in enforcement where it's appropriate. Very keen to do as much as we can around prevention. So a number of initiatives that we support through national campaigns and local campaigns, using some of our resources to heighten public awareness around safety and some of the preventative measures they can take themselves. Whilst we have some specialist trained officers in roads and armed policing teams that can focus on some of the strategic road networks, it's also the case that in the local policing teams there is a focus on traffic enforcement and awareness as well, where capacity allows them to do it, because it's not always about the main roads, it's also about some of the villages and smaller areas and lower speed roads that are affected. So a range of different approaches that are a mix between prevention and enforcement. Like I say, we try and deploy as smartly as we can based on what data tells us and about the greatest impact that we can have.
Grant, thank you. I was just thinking, OpSnap, it seems to me a very useful initiative to encourage public support, but I wondered how we were promoting it and what awareness there was amongst the public out there. This is my ignorance, but you may well have done significant work on this. But for example, have we launched a social media campaign advertising the existence of Snap recently?
So recently, I don't think so, but when it was first launched, there was activity undertaken. We do see some good returns, so the public are aware. Obviously, there are some challenges around transfer of data. There are some challenges about how useful some of the information that we receive is as well, because obviously the use of evidence is different standards, and not always what the public provide us is directly transferable. So probably an ongoing campaign that's required, but like I say, we do get some good return, and we will look at anything that we receive.
Grant, thank you. That was extremely useful, and I'm glad that the public has had the opportunity to put the things that concern them to you. So I'm grateful, Chief Constable, and to your team for all the work that's gone into developing answers for that. And I hope the message gets back to the public as a result. Let's now move on to it's really the long established agenda from the former PAF. So we now go into questions about the areas of the current plan which were due to be taken today. And I'm looking at item 6 and good stewardship of taxpayers' money. And we have a report on that in the papers.
So, Commissioner, the papers have been previously circulated. Would you like us to provide a synopsis, or would you like to go straight into any questions that you might have?
I think, given that members of the public who might not have seen the papers could view the video, it'd be helpful if you give a quick synopsis.
Okay. So on good stewardship of taxpayers' money, Peter, would you be able to give a summary of where we are, all things finance, in this stage? Commissioner, what I would add is some of the metrics through which we assess this then relates to areas of broader constabulary's business, for example, the control room being Nick Davison's. But if I ask Peter to give the financial back office part, and then if you have any questions on metrics, Nick will stand in and answer them.
That's grand. I think I'll stick to broad principles, because as the public doesn't have access to all the detail, and there's some fantastic detail presented in the papers, I'll stick with broad principles. But yes, if Peter could give us the overview, that'd be really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Set the scene.
Thanks, Commissioner. I'll start with the finance paper then. So the finance paper in front of you is the outturn report for the year 2020-2021. This is the first public meeting that we've been able to bring that outturn report to the public and to yourself. As an outturn report, it notes the final reserve movements that were recommended and approved by yourself earlier in the year, Commissioner. In terms of the revenue position, what it outlines is that the group underspent by 685,000 on its revenue budget, and that is 0.39% of the budget. This was achieved because as the pandemic kicked in during the financial year, we took a prudent response to that pandemic. We did an in-year savings review in order to put the brakes on spending, because we had concerns about the impact of the pandemic, both in terms of our costs, the impact on the wider economy, and because we had a forthcoming comprehensive spending review, which has obviously been pushed back into this year. And because of the uncertainty of that, we needed to be prudent and make sure that we could protect reserves as far as possible. And that's what we achieved. So we were able to underspend by 685,000 and protect reserves that effectively helps us build some resilience going into the 3-year comprehensive spending review, and all of that may entail. And there are clearly some uncertainties about the comprehensive spending review, because the government has got to take a review of its funding arrangements over that period, and will have to recover over time the debt that's been incurred in terms of managing the pandemic. In terms of the capital programme, that's outlined in the report as well. There was a significant underspend on the capital programme of around 12.5 million, and that was all connected to the estate schemes that we had ongoing, particularly the new development at the Broadland Police Station, which effectively, through the review that the former commissioner did, slipped a year back as we were revisiting the business case, quite rightly, in the face of the pandemic, but and the financial and economic position, and making sure that that business case still stood up to scrutiny and still was value for money, and enabled the estate strategy that we're now finalising to be delivered and realise the savings over a 40-year period. So that business case still stacked up, but what it did mean is that we pushed back the development of Broadland Police Station a year, so that the budget has effectively slipped into this new financial year, 21-22, and into 22-23. That's the summary of the financial paper, Commissioner. I don't know if you have any questions on that. If not, I can just give a brief summary in terms of the estates paper that also accompanies this section of the agenda.
Can I just ask two very quickly? You touched on the CSR and you touched on reserves. Now, I won't ask you to speculate about the outcome of the CSR, because, as you said, until the Chancellor decides how he's going to pay for COVID, we won't have a feel for where that's going. But we do have a significant figure shown in the reserves. Could you describe the freedoms and constraints on using those reserves?
Yes, that's fine, Commissioner. There is a reserve strategy that accompanies the medium-term financial plan and the budget report that is presented to the Police and Crime Panel, and that reserve strategy is revisited every year and was updated for the last Police and Crime Panel that was approving the precept in February earlier this year. Within that reserve strategy, we outline the limits that the reserves should not fall below. So our general balance, which is around 4.5 million, we look to maintain that between 2.5% and 3% of net revenue budget. And that is the reserve of last resort. If we were dipping into that reserve, then things would have got really dire in terms of our financial position. So that's a reserve that's protected, that we would not look to ever use. The other reserves that we have, and there are a number of them, so we have a reserve that funds capital spend for short life assets. We have an investor save reserve, which covers investments that are necessary or the cost of change connected to change programs. We have an insurance reserve, which is outlined what we require in terms of actuarial assessments, and we have re-established the budget support reserve that we originally had during the initial period of austerity that started 10 years ago. We were looking to close that reserve and not have a budget support reserve anymore, but with COVID and the forthcoming comprehensive spending review, we've re-established that reserve, and we now have 3.4 million in that reserve to see us over any of the challenges and funding shocks that we might have that come through the forthcoming CSR. There are also some reserves, Commissioner, that within that support your commissioning spending and your office as well. So there are some really important reserves there, particularly the capital one, short life asset funding. We don't get a capital grant of any significant size from government anymore. We used to get over £1 million a year, and that's been reduced to around 100,000. So that's left us with £1 million worth of shortfall year on year. And so the reserves are a really important part of that. Currently, because we protected the reserves through the pandemic ahead of the CSR that's coming, we've got around 19.9 million of reserves as outlined in the paper, which is about 11% of NRE. So that's above our minimum, which is 6%. But over the course of the medium-term financial plan, we're forecasting that that will reduce down to about 14.5 million, which is around 8%. So we continually need to review it and make sure that there's a resilience around those reserves. And our external auditors also do a value for money statutory review each year to make sure that there is enough resilience within how we are operating and planning financially.
That's great, thank you. And you very neatly answered my second question, which was to do with reserves to do with the capital budget. So I'm grateful for that. You had another part you were going to move on to.
Yes, there's also an estates update paper that accompanies this section of the agenda. Within that paper, it outlines the services that we've provided and how we've been able to undertake and maintain those services during the period of the pandemic and the COVID secure arrangements that we've had to have in place. And of course, we need to still do a lot of statutory work through estates and facilities. So that's outlined in that paper. The paper then also talks about the developments that we've been doing around the Broadland Police Station and Swaffham Police Station, and the new Swaffham Police Station is obviously now gone live, and the Broadland Police Station, the construction company will be on site on the 2nd of August, and the construction in earnest will start on the 23rd of August. And that new police station in Broadland is an enabler for the estates strategy that we're going to operate over the next 4 years in terms of decanting out some old and not fit for purpose sites and moving to more efficient arrangements with the new station at Broadland. And also there are some surplus sites that we are now currently in the process of marketing and selling, and again that paper outlines that as well. And there's also a short update in terms of the ongoing development at the Heatherset training centre.
Grand. You slightly broke up at the end, but I'm assuming you've come to an end.
Yes.
So, thanks for all of that. That was very clear. I don't have any further questions. I'm just trying to think. Yeah, I don't have any further questions for this forum. Peter, is there anything else you wanted to add, or are we ready to move on to the next item?
I think there was a section that Nick may be able to just cover briefly before we move on to the next agenda item. Sorry,
yeah, we were about to let him off the hook. We won't do that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. That's very helpful. Thank you. Commissioner, I did notice your attempts to let me off the hook, but my colleague obviously felt that was unnecessary. But so I think what we're alluding to here, Commissioner, is obviously the last bit of the paper in respect to good stewardship of taxpayers' money. So from page 36 onwards, there's some metrics that come under this particular heading here relating to public perception on how well the police are doing locally, but also our emergency targets. So I won't dwell too long, but just to highlight really, page 37, attending emergencies. So in the last 12 months, June to 2020 to May 2021, 92% of emergencies in the urban areas were attended within the target time, and 88.4% of rural emergencies were attended within the target time. So really good news in terms of the urban community, and only kind of 1.6% off the target for the rural community. So given what we've faced during the pandemic and all the strains and stresses on the organisation, actually I think that shows strong delivery to our local communities, even at a time of national kind of pandemic crisis. So I'm pleased about that. And again, in terms of answering the call, so you dial 999, you're in a crisis point, you need us to answer it. The target nationally is 90% within 10 seconds. Over that 12-month period, we were delivering that 91.1% of the time. We're answered within 10 seconds, and typically at the moment it's about 5 or 6 seconds, and we get to that 999 call, which I think is really, really strong performance. And then 101, I've already alluded to it, over the time frame, switchboard calls 4 minutes 33 seconds. not too dissimilar, 4 minutes and 43 seconds. So the force is still operating in line with previous service levels despite COVID. And I've already talked about all the ongoing investment in the CCR, which hopefully will impact upon that further. And then the final thing on page 39 that the paper describes really against the metrics is percentage of public believing that the police do an excellent or good job. So this comes from the crime survey of England and Wales typically. So the government kind of, in essence, surveys something like 600 homes within Norfolk's boundaries and comes up with a data set from those 600 encounters. Because of COVID, they're not doing that face to face, and we haven't got any future crime survey England and Wales data kind of published for future dates at the moment. But in support of this work, the Constabulary about 2 years ago developed its own public feelings perception survey, where we actually typically contact about 4,000 people, and it becomes statistically significant after 12 months. So we're in year 2 now. And again, the paper on page 40 outlines what our public through our local survey are telling us in terms of what they think about Norfolk Constabulary. So I'll just pick some highlights. Out of those 4,000 contacts, which we do, 90% think that the police are doing a good or an excellent job. 85% say that they have confidence in the police in the local area. 92% believe that police will treat them fairly and with respect. 98% feel safe in local hours during daylight hours. Drops to 78 after dark, but I think, you know, the fear of crime and darkness is understood there. 69% feel that the police understand local issues affecting their local communities. So those are the kind of the extra bits that that paper describes really. And if you had any questions in respect to that, I'll be happy to take them.
Just one supplementary on the response times in the rural communities. Mm-hmm. Is that a transit time issue, or is that an availability of response drivers, qualified response drivers?
So I think the answer is it can be all of them. It can be both of those two issues, but it can also be many other issues in terms of what's going on. So we know we work really hard to get the call out of the control room and across to dispatch and then out to the officer, and we monitor that to make sure that the CCR are kind of playing their part in that journey. We know that we've got then obviously the need to get those officers out to those jobs in terms of the availability of officers on the ground, and that's why we're structured the way we are, and we monitor that. There is some challenge within the organisation at the moment around all of the brand new police officers that we're bringing into the Constabulary as a consequence of the government's 20,000 uplift programme. Really intense, concentrated recruitment, seeing lots and lots of new officers coming into the Constabulary, and trying to obviously manage that and get all of those new officers through their response driver training with the resources that we've got, which weren't uplifted as part of the government's national police officer campaign. It didn't see those ancillary functions in training or in HR or in other parts of the business that needs to support police officers on the ground. That is a challenge for us, but we've been working really hard to be creative, to be able to find ways of releasing officers that can perform that driver training input to new student officers, and there's ongoing work to see what we might be able to do to see if we can afford to increase the capacity of our driver training scheme moving forward. But again, we're having to work through that alongside many other competing priorities.
But the direction of travel is in the right direction. It's getting better, not worse.
So we're holding it at the moment. I think there are some new national developments coming down line in terms of legislation and legal responsibilities on all police forces that we're also having to take on board and consider, which will make the thing quite challenging in terms of our ability to meet those national standards. They're being placed upon us, and we're having to react. At the moment, you know, we're being creative, we're being innovative in trying to get this to be the best place it can be, but it is having an impact. But you know, there's many things that we can do, and I hope that from the information that I've given you in this meeting and earlier meetings that we've had, you can see that we are still able to deliver that service that the public would expect us to, but we're just having to obviously spin a load of plates to be able to do that, whereas actually it would be nice to have a steady state in order to achieve it. But we're working through problems, and we're working to come up with solutions to deliver it.
Fantastic. I'm grateful. I think that's all on that agenda item. I think the action required was for me to note the report, which I duly note. Shall we move on to the next item? Item 8, deliver a modern and innovative service. Who do you want to lead on this, Paul?
Thank you, Commissioner. I wondered if we've missed one there. That's why I'm pausing.
Sorry, you're right.
7.
No, you're absolutely right. That's entirely my fault. I have jumped the line. You're absolutely right. Yes, support victims and reduce vulnerability.
Okay. I'm just getting my notes back together. Is it Nick or Raymond on this one? I've lost.
I've got this one.
It's Nick with Nick, isn't it? Sorry, poor old Nick, Giles. It's back.
It's always Nick. It's always Nick.
I know my place. Okay, so I'm giving you this paper on behalf of the Deputy Chief Constable Simon Medgicks, who, as you know, is not here. So I'll just very briefly in terms of the context of the paper. So this is a paper, Commissioner, updating on the Constabulary's response to the change to the codes of practice for victims of crime. And the paper talks about the background to the code, the rationalisation of the new 12 key rights that came in earlier this year, an overview of the strategy for how we're supporting victims and the initial steps that we're taking to be able to deliver against those new revisions to the code of practice that took place, I believe it was April earlier this year. So the Victim Codes of Practice for Victims of Crime, VCOP as it has become known, is a code. It's codified in terms of its position in terms of legislation and our duty to therefore formally respond to it and deal with it. But it sets out a number of objectives that the victims should expect in terms of service delivery from all criminal justice partners, not just the police, but also the courts as well as the Crown Prosecution Service. And it's been introduced actually since it passed into law in 2004, effected in 2006. And nationally, the Commissioner for Victims and Witnesses has a statutory duty to keep the code under review. And there was a recent review earlier this year, which is why I think we're updating you in terms of the Constabulary's response to that. So on the 1st of April this year, the new revised codes of practice were launched. The main changes really includes rationalisation of the code to focus on these 12 key areas or the rights for victims really. Also allowing the victims to decide the frequency around which they would like updates, giving them some more flexibility in respect to that. Also rationalisation of the contact points so victims know who they needed to speak to about their case rather than a cacophony of individuals, which can of course understandably be confusing and see things falling through the gap. Empowering officers and staff actually at the same time to just have a bit more discretion about when it would be appropriate to record victim personal impact statements as opposed to a mandatory you must do it for every single individual, even though actually the victim's saying, look, I'm fine with it, I don't want it or I don't need it. So that helpful discretion there, but also a great emphasis on explaining to the victims why a decision was particularly made. So I won't set out the 12 key rights, but they are in the paper, and that's obviously going to be published on the website for the public to see. And of course, if you went to Google search, you could find out what those 12 key rights are too. Commissioner, you'll be aware that obviously yourself and your office, as well as the Ministry of Justice, have oversight of the implementation of the codes. And in the future, it's the government's intention that actually the constabulary and partners will have to report progress and performance to the Home Office through the official data return. So we're obviously gearing up for that eventuality as well in respect to that. So COVID has had an impact, it's quite clear, and I know that is absolutely in the mind's eye of the joint Norfolk and Suffolk Criminal Justice Board in terms of overseeing the action plan to recover kind of post-COVID issues with yourself as well. In terms of how do we deal with the VCOP and the new 12 codes, well, we've had a joint Norfolk and Suffolk Constabulary supporting victims group now for some 3 years, which meets bi-monthly. That membership kind of is between Norfolk and Suffolk officers as well as the Police and Crime Commissioners officers, and it's really there to oversee and ensure the delivery of our response to the codes, and that will continue. where we make sure we monitor compliance, see what our performance against the actual standards are, what remedial action we need to take, what further training, support and development of the staff needs to be given to ensure that they understand what we need to do. As a result of that change in April, we have developed a new strategy to drive the activity forward broadly into the following themes about creating confidence amongst the workforce, about providing support to the victims and witnesses in their journey in the criminal justice system, and delivery of the quality of service, of course, is part of that, and then demonstrating compliance and quality so that we can actually meet our obligations under the codes themselves, and particularly when we start to have to report to the Home Office. So that work is ongoing under that group and is supported by your staff as well. And because of the changes in recent months, we've been doing a whole load of work with our workforce in terms of just reminding them of their responsibilities, what they actually are, why it's important, and providing education through webinars, online delivery, kind of bespoke briefings to our staff to make sure that that's okay. Early signs that this has been really positive. So in March 2021, the number of victim personal statements offered by staff recording on our system was 62, and that was consistent with the month previous to that. But then we put the engagement events in terms of reminding staff of the responsibility. And in April, it was 106. In May, it was 234. So again, really good progression in terms of meeting our responsibilities, and again updating victims of the outcome of cases. Compliance with that was sitting February at 79.6%, but by March we'd got that to 96%. So again, meeting our responsibilities in respect to that. So some really positive news there. Next steps. That victims group that I described are going to really focus in the next few months on the victim personal statement, making sure that we really got that nailed, and also the needs assessment. These are needs assessments for the victims that are deemed the most vulnerable, the most intimidated or persistently targeted, really, or subject to the most serious crimes, and how we make sure our assessment mechanism is as robust as it needs to be, making sure that we don't get that going through the gaps, and those that need a need assessment, in fact, get that need assessment, and we're working on that really. So that's a high level overview of what that paper is, Commissioner. If you had any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Just one. I suppose I'm really asking this in my capacity as chair of the Norfolk and Suffolk Local Criminal Justice Board, which you referred to. The report you've just given indicates that basically from a constabulary perspective, we're on the case and it's working, and there are no major issues that can't be worked through. The question I would ask is whether you have a view on how victims are passed through the system. Obviously, there is an incident, someone comes and reports it to the constabulary, you have, if I can describe it as such, first ownership of the victim, but then the victim's case goes off to the CPS, to the courts and beyond. Are you content that there is a sensible handover and that the victim's experience is sensible going through the whole process beyond the constabulary? And to what extent do you remain engaged, having established an initial relationship?
Nick,
So,
do you mind if I
yes,
come in on that one?
Of course, absolutely.
Okay, forgive me. So, Commissioner, I think in terms of working relationships, there's a good interface between the relevant partners. But it is clearly the case that the backlogs in the Crown Courts are proving very problematic for victims. Of secondary importance is the impact that that's having on the constabulary, which I'll come to in a moment. But in the Crown Courts, there were long waits pre-pandemic. Post-pandemic, those waits are even longer, and it's taking longer than we would like to get cases listed at court, and then full trials can take many months, often years, and that delayed justice is not good for victims. It's not good for those suspects who could be on bail awaiting trial as well for some fairly serious matters. The in-force consequence of that is that our victim and witness care teams, and indeed officers in the case for these crimes, need to retain contact with victims for longer. That puts more demand on us. The victim and witness care teams are often calling victims to reschedule cases. And every time you do that, of course, there's a risk of the victim or witness dropping out of the process. I'm pleased to learn that progress in magistrates' courts has been strong. So delays are back to, delays have pretty much been returned to pre-COVID levels. So magistrates' court recovery positive, Crown Court recovery a challenge. And there are still COVID restrictions in some of our Crown Courts. Frankly, the only solution I can see through this is more court capacity. There is definitely something for the constabulary and criminal justice partners to do around alternative disposals for out of court measures. And that is something that I think could be assisted with by commissioning, because we need the services to post those other out of court disposals towards, and we urgently need them. That would take some heat out of the system, but the most serious crime can only go to one location, and that's a Crown Court, and we need to increase the capacity somehow across justice partners. And I would say that the importance of the LCJB has never been greater, really, in helping us to achieve that aim.
Grant, that's helpful. Your point on restorative justice or alternative forms of justice is an important one. There was a question from the public on that, which I didn't take, but it is an area where I think further work is required, and I know my office is looking at that.
Yes, and it may be something I pick up with you out of meeting, but there's of course advantage to both police, victims and other partners as well. So if we can draw those partners into assisting us with that out of court, a broader out of court menu of options, that would be to everyone's advantage.
Agreed. Thank you. Was there anything more to be said on that point? I think you took that in lieu of Nick. That's grand.
Yes, nothing from our end, Nick, unless you wanted to come in. No.
Yeah,
No,
that's
thank
great.
you, Commissioner.
So I think that concludes that agenda item. And again, I think the action was for me to note, duly noted. So now we do get to item 8, deliver a modern and innovative service. Okay, Eamon.
Thank you. The paper that's been submitted is specifically around the implementation of body-worn video across the constabulary, and in summary, an overwhelming success on the whole, but not without challenge. So back in 2016, the project was initiated and an investment of about £1 million put into the procurement of devices for the vast majority of frontline staff. A lot of work has then gone into ensuring that we've realised some of the benefits that was potentially there in the use of the devices. So it was always expected that we would see some improvements around evidence capture. The hope would always be that it would make the service we're providing more legitimate, and that it would have genuine, tangible benefits for both operational elements of the service and indeed the professional standards elements of the service. So there have been some positives that have been identified as time has gone on. We have documented within the report a number of key operational things that have happened. There are some specific examples, but with the key focus being around the initial evidence capture at scenes of crime, we have found the ability to move forward with some victimless prosecutions that wouldn't previously been possible, and the corroboration of officer evidence and indeed victim evidence has been strong and has then played out in positive outcomes. We've also seen, from a professional standards point of view, much more timely returns on and investigations into complaints made against officers, because the material then either very quickly refutes some of those allegations or indeed supports them. The evidence is that much stronger than just written statement. There have been challenges that are documented within the paper. So there was the initial implementation challenges, which were fairly quickly overcome through training, investment, policy and procedural design. We have ongoing difficulties around redaction and movement of the data, because these are large files that can be difficult to move to other agencies, and it's an increased demand on officers who now need to review a type of evidence that didn't used to be available to them prior to and in compliance with their obligations under this disclosure legislation. We also have difficulties, and some of the next steps is looking at how we continue to be able to comply with our obligations around storage, and looking at more efficient ways of doing that. And we now move to a cycle 5 years down the line where actually all of the current devices require upgrade and replacement, and there's a program in place to ensure that that takes place. So in summary, it's been a very successful implementation. There's been some real tangible benefits around legitimacy, around evidence, and in some cases around efficiency. There are some challenges ongoing, and as you'll see from the paper, we have plans around how we'll meet those challenges as time goes on. So without wanting to drag it out much further, happy to take any specific questions you have, but that's just a brief overview of the paper.
Thank you very much. I mean, I've only got one supplementary. It doesn't relate directly to Norfolk. It's an overarching view that there have been a number of difficult scenarios in the media over the last few months, which have been recorded by body-worn camera, but the constabularies concerned have not been allowed to release that information to the public. I assume that relates to the redaction issues and the data protection issues that you referred to.
So I think all cases can be reviewed on their own merits, and some constabularies have released material at an early stage. It does create some complexities and some challenges around the criminal justice process if that material is then to be relied on in court at a later stage, and obviously some of the sub judice issues that it could create if we do release earlier than the individual having a trial in the normal manner. So it's not impossible, but obviously it has some elements of caution required around it. And clearly we have other partners that would have a real interest in us releasing evidence at an earlier stage than they would like.
So it's not the instant panacea that some journalists might think it could be.
No, definitely not.
No, good. Thank you. Anything else on that point? I think, again, I was asked to note, and so I've noted. If we're happy, well, let's go on to the Professional Standards Department complaints updates, item 9.
Thank you, and I will take this one myself. Normally an area for the Deputy Chief, but again, as you know, Simon's on leave, but this was mine a short time ago. You shared with the papers was a very lengthy report setting out where the constabulary is with all things complaints from the public. The report presents figures on complaints relating to the constabulary received from throughout the last financial year, so 1st of April 20 to 31st March 21. By way of context, it's important to say that two significant things have happened in that time period. Firstly, the Police and Crime Act of 2017 has made significant changes to the police complaints system. Effectively, it's seen a broadening out of the definition of what makes up a complaint, and therefore we are now recording a much wider range of issues as police complaints, and therefore that has significantly increased the number that we are recording. Secondly, the constabulary has been keen to increase the access to the complaints process. So we have through our local engagement officers been advertising or making it clearer as to how complaints can be lodged with the force. We've improved access to the constabulary by developing an online complaints form, and we also now have a confidential reporting mechanism for complaints being made as well. We have distributed a number of leaflets across libraries, police stations and in custody suites. all of which is national best practice to do so. But of course, the more you advertise that service, then it's inevitable that the more complaints that you would have. So I would urge anyone that reads the report to consider the figures against that context. Therefore, in the period, we've seen overall complaints increase by 28%. We break down our complaints into a number of categories. The area of largest complaints relates to the delivery of duties and services. Now, that itself covers many areas, but effectively it relates to police action following a matter being reported to us and levels of service. I would reflect back on the data that Nick gave during the CCR input about the hundreds of thousands of people that call us every year. Again, one complaint is one too many, but set against the context of the volume of calls and contacts that we have, our complaint levels, I believe, remain reassuringly low. We do, as has also been referenced today, employ an increasingly young workforce, and that young workforce will inevitably make mistakes. When they do, it's important that they learn and improve as a result of them. And the new complaint system, which comes about as a result of the Police and Crime Act, is very much focused upon learn, apologise, and improve. And that's how we as a constabulary intend to use the complaint system, and indeed do. So I guess what I'm saying is, with that young workforce, with that approach, with us broadening out access to the complaint system, you have the numbers that are presented in front of you in the report. Our professional standards department has been encouraged by me over the last 3 years to carry out 2 complaint reduction initiatives. One is to carry out some focused work supporting regular complainers to the constabulary to get to the heart of the problems to see if they can be solved, because we do have a cohort of high contact individuals. Secondly, to publicise more broadly where we have made, internally publicise, I should say, more broadly where we have made mistakes, so the wider organisation can learn, and not just the individual who's been subject to that specific complaint as well. So they're key planks of our complaints reduction work. Probably the only final thing I would say is, when someone does make a complaint to us, it's important that that's responded to in a timely manner, and the increase in the volume has sometimes made it difficult to do that. Now, often, so I shouldn't say often, occasionally, some of those who complain to us are then more difficult to contact a few days after the complaint has been made, so that often drives the wait. But equally, our inspectors are very busy, and we put a lot of responsibility on them, and it's typically our inspectors who respond to the complaints. In the last year, we've increased the number of inspectors in our local policing teams by 5, so that is now going to increase their capacity to deal with, amongst other things, complaints in a more timely manner. And we are also currently putting together a business case to explore whether putting a small amount of extra administrative support into our complaints department would also speed up the processing of dealing with these complaints. And I anticipate that business case will be in front of me during the next month. So I hope that will resolve the timeliness issue. Probably a good example of where a legislative or procedural change nationally has a significant impact on the constabulary, and therefore increases the costs being placed on the constabulary. So this is not the Chief Constable saying he disagrees with the changes to the complaint system, but a consequence of those changes is that I have been required to employ more inspectors, and will probably have to employ more administrative support to deal with the workload consequences of those changes. And on that note, ask if you have any questions, Commissioner.
I did have two, but you very neatly answered them. I was going to ask whether we could do anything to improve timelines, and I was going to ask whether you had sufficient resource, but you tidily addressed both of those at the end, for which I'm grateful.
Okay.
Fantastic. Where do we go next? Emergency Services Collaboration Group update.
Yes, and I will take that one myself as well, Commissioner. It's a verbal update. As you'll know, over recent years, we've sought to strengthen our collaboration with Norfolk Fire and Rescue Service. That has led to some positive developments. You'll be aware that we now have we now host the Fire and Rescue Service in our control room. So calls into the Fire and Rescue Service are answered at Police HQ Windham. That has advantages for us in terms of being able to provide an interoperable response to calls that require the two emergency services to deploy assets to, and would hold us in a very good position should we ever find ourselves in the awful situation of a major incident such as a terrorist type attack. Very relevant given the inquiry ongoing at the moment into the Manchester Arena attack. That arrangement would really help us in terms of those initial golden hour responses between emergency services. We have a number of tactical and operational memorandums of understanding in place with the fire service, which have been strengthened over the last couple of years. And during the pandemic, not so much now, but during the pandemic, the Fire and Rescue Service were assisting with the deployment to some incidents where their asset was just as able, if not more able than our resource to be able to deal with issues. So that might be vehicles broken down on highways or securing entry into premises where persons may have collapsed. We continue to actively explore whether there's any further collaborative opportunities within our community safety department. If there is, I think it would be most likely within youth engagement and youth outreach, but we're just completing a small amount of work there just to ensure that we've not missed any opportunity. We also continue to explore where we can share a state away from headquarters. You'll be aware that in a number of locations across the county, a good example being Holt, we are now co-locating with the Fire and Rescue Service so that we can make joint efficiency savings on our estate. It's good use of taxpayers' money to do so. Having carried out a fairly intensive period of work with the Fire and Rescue Service around collaboration, we probably are coming to the point where it would require more significant strategic / governance change for us to kick on any further. I think we're getting towards the tail end of the journey. It's been a positive one, but we're aware of some of the considerations under the latter stages of the PCC review, and we'll probably hold fire until there's more clarity in that regard before we push any further forward. And just finally to say, outside of the Fire and Rescue Service, we do retain an appetite for broader blue light collaboration, whether that be with other forces in the region or indeed other local partners. The door would never be closed on that. So that's probably all I was going to raise this morning, Commissioner, unless you have any questions.
That's very helpful. Just looking at my scratch pad. The one thought you mentioned, the Manchester Arena issue, and I think one of the things that seems to have come out of it is the amount of joint training that had been done. I just wondered when we had last exercised a major incident plan, and are there any plans in the future to exercise responses to major incidents to keep those skills alive?
Yes, so we of course, I'm conscious that it's an inquiry ongoing, but but obviously from the publicity that we would have all have seen, you can see some of the areas where it's absolutely appropriate that emergency responders listen to what's coming out of that inquiry and act now. And indeed, we intend to do so. We have over, goodness, probably the last 7-8 years, regularly with Blue Light Partners tested our response to major CT issues under operation known as Operation Skillgate. I believe, now I couldn't give you a date, I'm afraid, Commissioner, off the top of my head, but I believe we have another event planned in the very near future to retest our response in light of what we are hearing from Manchester. And because people move on, people move to different roles, and you just need to keep doing this. You can't do it too much. So I'm satisfied that we have well-tested plans, and I know that in light of Manchester, certainly in the next couple of months, I think we're testing them out again on a detailed tabletop exercise.
Great, thank you. And just turning to the fire collaboration piece, just for completeness, I met Councillor Margaret Dewsbury, who's the responsible Norfolk County Councillor, and the Chief Fire Officer, Stuart Ruff, yesterday. Obviously, you were out of office yesterday, so I need to give you a readout, but I think their conclusion is similar to your conclusion, that we need to wait for decisions about the future of fire governance before we take collaboration much further forward.
Good, thank you.
Good, which brings us on now to item 11, emerging operational organisational risks. Again, a verbal update.
Yeah, so this often merges with AOB, I would guess. The main operational and organisational risks have actually been pulled out during the course of the meeting today. I won't touch upon the pandemic again. I gave an update earlier on, but operationally, the test and trace app has been a real challenge for us. The other main risk, I think, relates to demand, and as we've been predicting for many months, the busy summer that we expected has now well and truly kicked in, and it is really testing the resilience of the constabulary. I think the officers and staff of the constabulary have done a phenomenal job over the last few months. They've shown an incredible level of dedication and maintained a level of service that I'm really proud of, despite and despite those pressures, they're still coming in with a smile on their face and doing their absolute best. So I'd like to put on record my thanks to my staff during this busy period. You will have noted, Commissioner, that we've had a handful of high-profile incidents, not least a couple of homicide investigations in the last 2 months. I'm pleased that we've brought them to good resolution. We do have some other high-profile investigations that are ongoing, but again, I'm happy that they are being managed well. That's more the operational side. In terms of the organisational side, we are again, as we alluded to earlier, deep into our planning ahead of the comprehensive spending review. We are working up contingencies so that we are well placed, regardless of how the review goes. Of course, I would say that if I had lots of spare money kicking around the organisation, I would not have been doing my job for the last 3 years in my spell as the deputy. It's taxpayers' money, so we are lean and we invest everything that we can into frontline services. So whilst I'm developing up options, of course, those options are not going to be easy ones, but it's the right and appropriate thing to do, that we are planning up our contingency. And over the coming months, Peter and I will be heavily engaged with your office so that you're very aware as to the activity that we're undertaking. Probably the final organisational update that I would provide is that we continue to meet our targets for our slice of the 20,000 national uplift programme. So that's the national increase of 20,000 extra police officers. Of course, our slice of that is, we think, going to be about 220, but we are well on track with recruitment. We go live with the new police entry and qualifications framework in April. Everything is on track with that. Again, that will have an abstraction impact, but we are doing our best to minimise that so far as possible. But in terms of the Prime Minister's commitment to increase those extra officers, we are well ahead of target, and we will achieve the numbers, I have no doubt.
Thank you. A little earlier, you alluded to the potential question of experience of a young workforce. We've got the uplift. We also have replacement of routine churn. Could you say a little bit more about, I hesitate to call it potential risk, but the issues that might arise from, I'm guessing 30 to 40% of the workforce actually being really quite young, and in terms of service having less than 3 or 5 years service, which must have implications on efficiency and effectiveness.
Yes, and they are the figures that we're playing with, Commissioner. And of course, the model that policing typically has is that all of those officers start their place in response cars. So you've got a pooling of that inexperience in your front-facing positions. Now, I happen to think there's a lot of good with this, because in that young, vibrant workforce, you've got a whole load of motivation. You've got a whole load of people who are really excited to be here and driven to serve their communities. So there's a lot of good. Wind the clock forward 5 years, we will have both an experienced and an energised workforce if we get that investment in training right. And that's why our investment at Heverset and the broader growth that we've put into our L&D department is also so important. However, with the young workforce, as I alluded to in the complaints update, mistakes will occur. The starting pay that officers receive now means that it really is, well, it means that we rarely see an experienced person coming to us as part of a career change. The average age of new recruits is now in the very early 20s. So they're raw. They are rookies in every sense of the word. We therefore, to support them, need to invest in training, as I alluded to earlier, but we also need to invest in supervision. And we are taking a good close look at our supervisory ratios. As I referred to earlier, we've increased the number of local inspectors by 5. We will definitely be needing to increase the number of sergeants as well, to ensure that they're appropriately supervised. Because whilst we're doing all of this, the complexity of what we're dealing with is going up at the same time. So there's a little bit of a perfect storm. So in short, yes, it's a problem. I do think there's also opportunity with it, but it's ever so important that we support these officers so that they can make the best of that opportunity and be the best that they can possibly be.
That's great, thank you. And I think in conclusion on that agenda item, I would just like to echo your thoughts on the work of your staff and the effects that police officers are having on the ground, which, you know, from my vantage point has been fantastic, notwithstanding some very significant pressures they've faced. I'm just saddened that they haven't got the pay rise to reflect their efforts, but such is life, and I'm afraid we've probably got to put a full stop there and just live with it. But it's, to my mind, and I'm very happy to say this publicly, I don't feel it is the right signal to send to officers who've put in a magnificent effort, particularly over COVID, but they've had a longer run up to this through austerity as well. So yeah, my congratulations to them all and commiserations on that last point. But yeah, thank you.
No, thank you.
Which brings us to any other business, although we may have embraced that as we've gone along. But is there any other business that the Constabulary wishes to raise?
Nothing from mine, Commissioner, and I can't see no shakes of heads at our end, so nothing from us, thank you.
Anything on my side of the house? No, looks very positive. The dates of the future meetings are listed on the agenda. The date of the next PAM is the 20th of October, kicking off at 2 p.m. This meeting had to be a virtual meeting because of despite the unlocking, just the ongoing need to be cautious about COVID. And I think we'll make a decision nearer the time as to whether we have another virtual meeting, whether we have a hybrid meeting, or whether we open it up. If we open it up, I would suggest we look for a venue outside Wymondham, so we protect the functions there. Heatherset might be a possibility, or there may be another option, but we'll take that once we've got a better feel for the situation. But in the meantime, I'm conscious a huge amount of work went into preparing for this. That's reflected in the papers that were presented. And I'm very grateful, Paul, to you and your team for all that went into that, and indeed to my team for their preparation of me, because I'm conscious I've got L plates up. But there we go.
No, thank
if there's
you.
nothing further, let's draw a line and yeah, enjoy the afternoon sunshine.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.